The Galactic Council chamber floated between stars like a giant crystal bubble, and Ambassador Kyra Blackwood stood at the human platform with her silver hair tied back tight and her military uniform pressed sharp because today would change everything. For Earth and humanity beside her stood the mysterious woman who called herself Lyrian, and nobody knew what she really was because she looked like an elf from old stories with glowing purple eyes and hair that shimmered like captured starlight. And she had appeared 3 months ago in the middle of the United Nations building, just stepping out of thin air and refusing to leave. Kyra alone ever since, Lyrian whispered softly that they fear what they cannot understand, and her long fingers moved through the air, making reality ripple and shimmer, and there, beside her, invisible to most eyes, coiled her companion, which she called Nethys, and it was a dragon made from starfire and shadow, and its massive body was hidden in a pocket dimension that leaked strange light at the edges. The dragon rumbled deep and low, and the sound did not travel through air but through space itself, and every alien species in the chamber felt uneasy and nervous without knowing exactly what council speaker. Vexther, who looked like a giant praying mantis from the creche, Dominion clicked his sharp mouthparts in anger, and his many eyes reflected Kira and Lyrian in 1,000 tiny images, and he demanded that the human delegation explain the presence of this unauthorized entity because their sensors could not classify her species, and their historical databases contain no record of her kind. Kyra kept her voice steady and firm when she said that Lyrian was under human protection, and that was all the council needed to know. Counselor Zafina, who was pure energy trapped in a crystal container, turned bright angry red and shouted that 3 months ago, reality itself had cracked open when Lyrian appeared, and their scientists had detected the dimensional breach across half the galaxy, and she could be a weapon or an invader or something terrible. Kyra interrupted coldly, saying Lyrian was a friend and nothing more. The chamber exploded with noise as 73 different alien species all started shouting and clicking and sending telepathic waves of anger because they were outraged that humans would be so bold and so foolish. Lyrian stayed calm and moved her hand in a small gesture, and suddenly Nethys stirred in his hidden dimension, and every holographic screen in the chamber flickered with static, and for just 1 moment each council member saw something that froze their blood and made their hearts stop because they saw themselves reflected back, but wrong and older and decaying and dead. The chamber went completely silent after Thad of Exeter demanded to know if Lyrian dared to threaten the council, and his voice was cold as deep space ice. Lyrian spoke softly and said it was only a warning because she was here. She stayed with humanity because they alone among all the galaxy species had offered welcome before demanding answers, and she suggested the council remember that next time they wondered what humanity was capable of. Protecting Kyra hid her smile because she did not fully understand what Lyrian was or why this mysterious woman had chosen humanity. But she knew power when she saw it, and she knew fear in her enemies' eyes even better. Kyra told the council they had a decision to make, because humanity had asked for full council membership 17 times over the past century, and each time the answer had been no, because humans were too violent and too primitive and too young. But now the council could see that humanity was not alone, and it earned respect from beings the council could not even understand. Counselor Morax, who was a collective mind of many robots, asked if that was a threat. Kyra smiled sharp as broken glass and said it was simply a fact because humanity had been building and growing and preparing while the council kept them locked out, and humans had made allies. The council could not imagine and explored dimensions. The council feared to acknowledge and done it all without permission or help. The dragon Nethys chose that exact moment to show himself partially, and one massive eye bigger than a starship opened in the air above the assembly, and it looked at all of them with cold intelligence older than stars. Kyra continued speaking and said, here was humanity offering a proposal, and the proposal was simple because the council could grant humans full membership and give them the rights and respect they had earned. Vexther demanded to know what would happen if the council refused. Lyrian smiled, and it was beautiful and terrible at the same time, and she said that if the council refused, then humanity would stop asking for permission to exist in their universe, would simply take their place, as was their right, and the council would have to decide if they wanted humanity as friends inside the council or as something far more dangerous outside it. The dragon eye closed, and the terrible tension broke like a snapping wire of Vexthur. Clicked his mouth parts rapidly, which meant stress in his species, and said the council would deliberate, and the humans were dismissed while the council decided. Humanity fade as Kyra and Lyrian walked toward the exit. Kyra leaned close and whispered, asking if they had just threatened the most powerful Alliance, and the Galaxillyrian laughed like silver bells ringing and said no, because they had simply reminded the council that power comes in forms they had forgotten to fear, and the threat was always there, and they just made it visible for everyone. 2C behind them, Nethies purred in his dimensional pocket, and the sound was like reality itself making happy noises, and the Nethi council chamber trembled and shook, and 73 different species began arguing with desperate fear because they had just realized the rules of the game had changed forever, and nothing would ever be the same again. The vote would come soon, and humanity with its mysterious guardian and her impossibly real dragon would be waiting and watching and ready for whatever came next, because Earth had found its voice among the stars. 27 hours after the council meeting ended, Kyra woke up to screaming alarms in her quarters on the orbital station, and her military training kicked in before her mind was fully awake because danger was coming fast. Larian stood by the window, with her starlight hair flowing in a breeze that should not exist in the sealed room, and Nethies appeared around her shoulders like an impossible scarf with scales that shifted through colors that had no human names. Larian said quietly that they were coming because the Kresh had decided uncertainty was more dangerous than war. Lieutenant Maya Brooks appeared on the communication screen with her young face white as snow, and she reported that a Kresh battle fleet had just appeared near Earth with 40 massive warships, and they were demanding Kyra return immediately and Lyrian surrender, or else Kyra felt her blood turn to ice because they had gone straight for Earth and her home and everyone she loved. Maya continued speaking with cracking voice and said the lead ship was commanded by Vexthur himself, and he was broadcasting on all channels that humanity had 48 hours to give up Lyrian, or he would demonstrate what happens to species who protect dimensional threats. Lyrian turned from the window, and Kyra saw something in those purple eyes she had never seen before. And it was rage, but not the quick, hot anger of humans, but something cold and ancient and absolutely merciless. Larian repeated the words 48 hours and asked Nethies what he thought of their timeline. The dragon growled, and the sound made the entire station shake and groan in warning. Alarms went off because the structure was being stressed beyond safe limits. Skyra started to say that Lyrian should wait, but the mysterious woman was already moving. Lyrian said no more waiting because they had threatened Kyra home and her people, and the only species in the galaxy that had looked at something unknown and offered welcome instead of weapons. And it was time the council learned why that had been the correct choice. Admiral Helen Carter appeared on another screen with her old face looking grim and serious, and she said she needed permission to fight because Vexthur had just destroyed the Armstrong moon base to show he was serious, and 3,000 people were gone and just erased from existence. Skyra hands became fists, and her whole world tilted sideways because the Armstrong base was where her daughter Emma had been stationed. And Emma was there, and now Emma was gone. Lyrian caught Kyra before she could fall and commanded her to breathe because grief would come later. But now they had to act. Kyra asked what they could do because the Kresh had 40 warships that could each crack a planet, and humanity only had 12 defense stations and a few patrol ships, and it was not even close to a fair fight. Lyrian smiled terribly and said Kara was thinking in 3 dimensions and thinking like prey, and she should let Lyrian show her how predators think. Lyrian made a gesture, and suddenly the window showed not just the physical ships, but something more, because there were threads of light connecting each Kresh vessel, and data streams and power lines and quantum communication channels that made the fleet work as one unit. Lyrian explained that every system had weaknesses, and the Kresh relied on absolute coordination because their ships were extensions of Vexthur, will, and linked through quantum arrays, and that made them devastatingly effective, but also devastatingly vulnerable to someone who could see and change quantum states, Admiral Carter asked if Lyrian was going to attack the fleet. Lyrian said no, because they were going to make the Kresh attack each other instead. Kyra wiped her eyes and forced herself to think like a soldier instead of a grieving mother, and asked what Lyrian needed from humanity. Lyrian said she needed time and trust, because in exactly 30 minutes Vexthor would broadcast his final demand and threaten to destroy major Earth cities and give humanity 1 hour to decide. Kyra asked how. Lyrian knew that. Lyrian tapped her head and said she could see probability streams and the shape of intentions and the exact moment where Vexthor's certainty would become his downfall, and she needed Kyra to do something very human and very foolish and very brave. Kyra asked what that was. Lyrian said, simply tell him. No. Kyra laughed a sharp, broken sound and asked if that was all, because just one word seemed to simple. Lyrian explained that while Vexthor was processing that response and raging at human boldness, she and Nethys would rewrite the quantum signatures of every ship in his fleet, and his fleet Admiral Carter asked if they could really do that from so far away. Lyrian said distance was an illusion. You existed partially outside normal space, and the real question was whether humanity could live with the consequences. Kyra asked what consequences. Lyrian said that when this was done, the Galactic Council would know humanity had friends who could end fleets with a thought, and they would be terrified of humans forever. Thought of Emma, and 3,000 souls erased to make a point, and said let them be terrified. Then 30 minutes passed in organized chaos as Kyra worked with Earth defense forces and evacuated civilians from targeted cities while publicly pretending humanity might surrender. When Vexthor broadcast came, it was exactly as Lyrian predicted, and his mantis face filled every screen on Earth in an orbit, and his sharp mouthparts clicked with cruel satisfaction as he demanded human surrender. Lyrian, in 1 hour, or watch their cities turn to ash. The transmission ended, and the world held its breath. Kyra walked to the communication console, knowing billions were watching, and this moment would define humanity, future, forever. She opened the channel so every screen showed her face instead of Vexo. Kyra said one word clearly and firmly, and that word was no. Reality shifted and changed in that instant. Lyrian form exploded into pure light, and Nethys emerged fully from his dimensional pocket, with his true size so vast he seemed to wrap around the station and around Earth itself like a dragon made from stars and shadows and the spaces between spaces. The Kresh fleet with its 40 mighty warships suddenly found their quantum communication singing with new and wrong harmonics, and Vexthor screamed as his perfect control shattered and broke in his ships, each receiving different targeting data and seeing different threats began to fire their weapons, but not at Earth, because they fired at each other instead. Void lit up with weapons fire as the Kresh fleet tore itself apart in confusion, and every ship thought the others were enemies, and in 7 minutes it was over, and 40 dreadnoughts were reduced to floating wreckage and escape pods while Earth defense forces had not fired a single shot. Lyrian collapsed back to normal and breathed hard and said it was done. Kyra stared at screens showing the destroyed fleet and felt no happiness but only cold satisfaction. Lyrian said they would not come back with more ships because every species in the council had just watched their most powerful military force destroy itself for threatening humanity. Communication panels lit up with thousands of incoming messages and requests for talks and offers of alliance and pleas for mercy, and from the council itself came one message saying emergency session and immediate vote on human membership and attendance. Mandatory. Kyra looked at Lyrian and asked why she had chosen humanity. Lyrian smiled softly and said because when she emerged from the void lost and confused and potentially dangerous, humanity had not shot first but offered her coffee and asked if she needed help, and the coffee was terrible. But the kindness was genuine, and in a galaxy of ancient powers and old grudges, genuine kindness was the rarest power of all. Nethys purred in agreement, and the sound made stars tremble in their orbits. Arth had spoken its one-word reply, and the galaxy had heard it loud and clear. The emergency council session started in complete chaos, because representatives from 73 species crowded. The chamber and their usual calm was shattered by what they had witnessed, and the Kresh fleet wreckage still floated in Earth orbit. Like a monument to how warfare had become obsolete, Kyra stood at the human platform exhausted beyond anything she had ever felt because she had spent 6 hours coordinating with world leaders and trying not to think about Emma because grief was a weight she would carry later, but right now she had to be Ambassador Blackwood and not a grieving Mother Larian. Stood beside her looking recovered from her earlier effort, and Nethes remained visible this time with his massive body coiled around. Their platform like a protective snake, and his galaxy eyes tracked every movement in the chamber. Assembled aliens gave the dragon plenty of Space Counselor Zafina, pulsed angry light, and shouted that this was outrageous because humans had allowed a dimensional entity to destroy a council fleet, and this was an act of war. Kyra replied coldly that Speaker Vexler had fired first and vaporized the Armstrong moon base without warning and killed 3,000 civilians to make a point. So humanity had responded to aggression with self-defense counselor Scareth. Was reptilian hissed that humans had not defended themselves because that creature had done it, and that was the problem because humanity had become the protected. The species of something they could not classify or predict or control. Kyra said firmly that humanity did not control Lyrian because she was not their weapon, but their friend Counselor Morax noted in their many robot voices that this friend could make the most powerful warships destroy themselves and existed partially outside their dimension and had a dragon companion made of impossible concepts. Lyrian finally spoke, and her soft voice carried clearly, and she said the council was afraid. And she understood that because fear of the unknown was rational, but she could offer them clarity. Holographic images appeared, showing countless worlds and species thriving under strange skies, and Lyrian explained she was not from their dimension. And Nethes, and she came from a place where reality flowed differently, and the rules they accepted as fundamental were merely suggestions, and they had walked between worlds for longer than the oldest civilizations had accessed Vexter, who had survived. The fleet destruction demanded to know why she was here, and why she appeared now in human space, if not as some cosmic invasion. Lyrian said simply that the barriers between dimensions were thinning, and something was coming that made her look as weak as humans seemed, and when it arrived, the galaxy would need champions who understood both physical and metaphysical reality and humanity. Despite their youth had that potential, the chamber went silent because this was new information that changed. Everything. President Walsh appeared on Kyra's private screen, warning her to play carefully because the aliens were scared, which made them dangerous but also intrigued, and that invasion story could be their leverage. Kyra addressed the council saying, Lyrian had come with warnings and offers of knowledge, and had been teaching human scientists about dimensional physics, and in 3 months humanity had learned more about reality than in the previous centuries. Kareth accused them of advancing military. Lyrian corrected him, saying they were advancing existentially because military might meant nothing when your enemy could reach through dimensional walls and unmake you from inside. Was bigger and stranger than their councils and fleets and territorial disputes. Counselor Prime Meridian, who was a crystalline computer and rarely spoke, finally activated, and its voice was like mathematics made into sound, and it proposed they vote on human membership immediately, but with conditions. Kyra asked what conditions. Carefully, Prime Meridian listed them as full disclosure of all knowledge from the dimensional entity and limitations on human expansion, and Lyrian submitting to regular observation, and the dragon being contained or banished. Nethes growled, and the sound made the station structure groan dangerously. Kyra said flatly that was unacceptable, because they were asking humanity to hand over advantages and limit sovereignty and subject their friend to invasive monitoring and banish her companion, and that was not membership, but subjugation. Vexter snapped that it was compromised because humans got a council seat, and the council got assurances they would not become a threat. Lyrian said pleasantly that they already were a threat as demonstrated when the Kresh fleet became scrap metal, and the question was not whether they had power, but whether humanity would use that power within the council framework or outside. A Admiral Carter voice crackled through Kyra earpiece, saying their sensors picked up something new and multiple unknown ships were incoming, and arrival time was 40 minutes. Kyra announced to the council that unknown vessels were approaching, and sensor profiles matched no known species. The chamber erupted in confusion, and Lyrian's expression shifted to something between curiosity and concern. And she murmured that they came faster than expected because they must have felt Nethi's manifestation. Since power of that magnitude left ripples across dimensional boundaries, Kyra demanded quietly what they were. Ilarian replied they were scouts from the other side, testing whether this dimension was ready for harvest. Kyra voice rose despite her control, asking what harvest. Myntarians spoke loudly to the whole chamber, saying that while they argued about human membership, the actual threat had arrived, and these were entities from a dimension where matter itself was food and ships and stations, and worlds were just resources to be consumed. The council watched tactical displays update showing 12 massive signatures, each larger than a Kresh warship, emerging in Earth's outer system. Larian continued explaining this was what she came to warn about and why she chose to appear in human space, to teach a species young enough to learn new ways, because their old ways were useless against what was coming. Admiral Carter reported the newcomers were scanning the system and just fired on the research station, and the station was gone, not exploded but erased from existence. Of Exther, mandibles clicked rapidly, saying they needed coordinated defense with all council species contributing ships. Immediate Larian said they had maybe 4 hours before ships arrived, and these entities would consume half the orbital infrastructure by then, because they ate matter and energy and information efficiently. Counselor Morax demanded what Lyrian suggested. Then Lyrian looked at Kyra and said she suggested they stop treating humanity like children needing protection and start treating them like soldiers needed on front lines, because she and Nethys could fight these scouts and probably win, but could not be everywhere, and they needed allies who understood dimensional warfare, and they needed humans. Kyra straightened despite exhaustion and said if the council granted humanity full membership with no conditions and no limitations and full voting rights, then humans would share everything. Lyrian taught and fight beside them against this threat and continue learning, so next time the galaxy was better. Prepper Redzafina asked what happened if they refused. Kyra said then Lyrian and Nethys would protect Earth and humanity interests, and the rest would face harvesters alone with conventional weapons and outdated physics, and she gave them 48 hours before homeworlds started disappearing. Council members talked among themselves in different languages and telepathy and quantum codes, and Kyra could see the calculation in their alien features because they weighed fear of humanity against fear of unknown harvesters and pride against survival. Prime Meridian spoke first, calling for a motion to grant humanity full council membership immediately, and asked all in favor. The vote took 30 seconds and was unanimous. Prime Meridian announced welcome to the Galactic Council Ambassador Blackwood and asked if their mysterious friend could please save them all. Lyrian smiled and asked Nethys if they should show the council what dimensional predators looked like when properly motivated. The dragon roared, and the sound echoed not through space, but through quantum foam of reality itself, and in Earth's outer system. The Harvester Scouts suddenly found themselves facing something they had never encountered before, because this prey hunted back. Kyra allowed herself a small, fierce smile, because humanity had its seat at the table, and now they just had to survive long enough to use it properly. The war, and the real war, was only just beginning. Lieutenant Sophie Kane had been reading sensor data for 8 years and prided herself on staying calm, but that composure shattered completely when she saw what the harvesters actually were. Sophie's voice cracked when she told Admiral Carter that they had visual confirmation on hostile vessels, and the Admiral needed to see this immediately. The tactical display zoomed close on the nearest harvester, and Carter felt her 62 years of military experience fail to provide any useful context whatsoever. The thing was not a ship at all, but more like a hole in reality, shaped into something that approximated a vessel, and where normal space should show stars and galaxies. The harvester showed writhing darkness with geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly as Carter watched one entity extended a tendril of unspace toward a mining asteroid, and the asteroid did not explode or break apart, but simply stopped existing as its mass and energy flowed into the harvester like water down a drain chute. Lieutenant Maya Brooks whispered from her station that they were eating the solar system and actually consuming it piece by piece on Earth. In the war room beneath the city, Kyra watched the same feeds with assembled council representatives, and vexed their mandibles clacked with what might be fear and Zafina. Crystalline form had shifted from confident red to uncertain purple. Scareth hissed that this was impossible, because matter could not simply cease to exist in conservation of energy. Was absolute Lyrian interrupted, saying conservation did not apply when dealing with entities existing across multiple dimensions simultaneously, and they were not destroying matter but transferring it to their home dimension, where different physical laws applied, and to them this reality was like a buffet, where they sampled and consumed and moved on. Admiral Carter demanded how they could fight something like that. Lyrian said simply that they could not fight with conventional weapons, and told them to watch. The display shifted to show the Jupiter defense platform, which was one of humanity's most advanced military installations, and its commander, Captain Lisa Morgan, had decided to engage the nearest harvester because Morgan was known for aggressive tactics. Humanity, most powerful plasma cannons, fired in perfect coordination, with enough force to vaporize a small moon, and the beams struck the harvester and simply vanished, absorbed into its impossible geometry. The harvester response was casual and almost contemptuous, as a tendril of unspace reached out and touched the platform and the entire installation. With 3,000 personnel and advanced weapons ceased to exist. Carter shouted Morgan's name in anguish. Kyra felt grief, like a physical blow, because more lives were gone and more people erased, because she had brought Lyrian to Earth and welcomed the unknown instead of shooting it. Lyrian placed a gentle hand on Kyra's shoulder, as if reading her thoughts, and said this was not her fault, because they would have come regardless, since dimensional barriers were thinning galaxy-wide, and Lyrian had simply given humanity a chance to be ready. Kyra said bitterly, they were not ready because their weapons were useless, and their ships could not touch the harvester. Lyrian agreed conventional weapons were useless, but said humans had something better now, because they had knowledge and allies who understood the battlefield. Nethys manifested fully in the war room, with his massive form somehow fitting in the space without, actually occupying it, which was a dimensional trick that made several counselors coil in fear, and the dragon galaxy eyes focused on the holographic harvesters. In this spoke for the first time, and his voice was like grinding tectonic plates given sound, and he said there were 12 scouts testing the dimension for viability, and the main swarm would follow if scouts reported adequate resources, so they must eliminate all scouts and prevent report transmission. Vexter demanded if Nethys could destroy them. Nethys said destroy was wrong, but banish was perhaps possible, and consume in turn was definitely possible. Lyrian smiled at her companion and said he had been hungry, keeping himself compressed and trying not to frighten their new friends, but the restraints were off now, and he should show them what a dimensional apex predator looked like. What happened next would be studied by scientists for centuries. Tikhomenethys exploded into motion, with his form expanding beyond merely physical, and he did not fly toward harvesters in any normal sense, but simply repositioned himself through dimensional space, appearing beside the nearest scout in a burst of starfire ethy. Harvester turned attention to this new prey with tendrils of unspace reaching out to consume Nethys, opened his mouth and roared, and the sound tore through reality itself, and the harvester tendrils evaporated, unable to withstand concentrated dimensional force. And then Nethys bit down, with his teeth sinking into impossible geometry, and began to feed the harvester. Thrashed as its coherence fractured, while Nethys consumed it from inside out and metabolized its exotic matter and strange energies. And within 30 seconds, the harvester ceased to exist. Not transferred, but genuinely destroyed, with its essence now part of the dragon. Nethys belched with a sound like a supernova echo and said it was tasty and reminded him of void sharks from another dimension, and he wanted more. He vanished and reappeared beside another harvester, and this one tried to flee by tearing open a hole in space to escape back home, but Nethys followed through, and for a moment sensors showed readings from a place that should not exist, where up and down were temporal concepts and light moved in spirals and physics was suggestion. Not long Nethys emerged again, hauling the screaming harvester back to normal space, like a cat with a mouse, and proceeded to methodically tear it apart, while distributing chunks of impossible matter to Lyrian, who absorbed them into her own form, Sophie. said in disbelief that the dragon and elf woman were literally eating the harvester. Slirian corrected her, saying they were not eating but recycling and reducing dimensional signatures and ensuring harvesters could not regenerate or report back to the swarm, and it was. Ecological management of hostile dimensional fauna. Admiral Carter found herself laughing despite. Horan said, "Why did training not cover interdimensional ecological management?" President Walsh, who had been silent, said grimly that it would now, and when this was over, they needed to establish training programs because if humanity was going to be the Council dimensional warfare specialists, they needed more than just Lyrian and Nethislarian. Agreed while casually dodging a desperate tendril from a fleeing harvester, and she caught it with one hand as reality rippled around her fingers, and said she had begun identifying candidates among human population, including Kyra, daughter Kyra. Heart stopped, and she said, Emma was dead because the Armstrong base was destroyed. Lyrian interrupted gently, saying that was where Emma's body had been. But Emma had unusual quantum entanglement with her own possible futures, and when the base was destroyed, part of her consciousness existed in superposition. Both dead and alive, and neither here nor elsewhere in Lyrian, had encouraged her waveform to collapse toward survival. Kyra gripped the table for support and asked if her daughter was alive. Valerian said Emma was in a state where alive and dead were arbitrary distinctions, but yes, she could guide Emma back to conventional existence if Emma agreed, because the process would change her forever, making her part human and part dimensional hybrid. Kyra thought of Emma, who was brilliant and brave and always pushing boundaries, and said with absolute certainty that Emma would choose to come back and would want to be part of whatever came next. Lyrian nodded, saying when this battle ended they would retrieve Emma, but first the sensors lit up with new contacts. The remaining 10 harvesters had stopped their casual consumption and regrouped, forming a pattern that made quantum sensors scream with feedback. Counselor Morax warned they were coordinating and linking dimensional signatures into some kind of gestalt entity. The harvesters merged with their impossible geometries flowing together until they formed something vast and terrible, and the combined harvester pulsed with malevolent intelligence as reality groaned under strain of its presence. And Atheus said with satisfaction that now this was a proper meal, and asked Lyrian if they should show the council what they did to the devourer of worlds in another dimension. Lyrian warned the council might not be ready for that technique because it tended to leave lasting scars on local spacetime. Carter growled she did not care if it scarred the whole universe, because that thing ate half her fleet and was snacking on Saturn rings, so they should use whatever technique they wanted. Lyrian and Nethes exchanged a look of silent communication between beings who had fought together across countless realities, and then they moved. What followed was not battle in any normal sense, but more like watching two fundamental forces of nature assert dominance over a Thurlarian. Came pure light, with her form expanding until she surrounded the combined harvester like a star-going nova, and Nethes became shadow and fire, weaving through dimensions and biting at the harvester from angles that did not exist in three-dimensional space. The harvester fought back with tendrils of unspace, lashing out, trying to consume its attackers, but Lyrian and Nethes were no longer vulnerable targets because they had synchronized their dimensional frequencies. It's becoming a unified force, existing partially in the harvester home dimension and partially in normal space. They began rewriting the harvester fundamental structure and altering its dimensional signature and forcing. 3 months after the harvester attack, Earth had transformed into something never seen before because it became a nexus point where physical and dimensional realities merged under controlled conditions. Mae Blackwood stood in what had once been the Armstrong crater, now rebuilt as the dimensional research. It's complex, and she marveled at her new existence because she looked human enough, with the same dark hair and sharp features that marked her as Kyra daughter. But when she moved, reality rippled around her edges, and when she thought her consciousness existed in multiple probability states at the same time, she was both Emma Blackwood, human, and something entirely new. Dr. Rachel Kim, who had been a quantum physicist before Lyrian, arrived and was now a dimensional mechanics specialist. Adjusted her instruments that measured frequencies which did not officially exist according to old physics, and told Emma to try shifting again and hold the transition for 15 seconds. This time I nodded and focused hard and stepped sideways through dimensional space, and to observers she seemed to flicker like a broken hologram, being simultaneously present and absent, and she could feel dimensional currents flowing around. Hearn could sense the thin spots where reality membrane was weakest. Rachel called out 14 seconds, then 15, then 16, and said Emma was improving fast. Hannah stepped back fully into normal space, breathing hard because the transitions still exhausted her, but less each time, as she was learning and adapting and becoming something that could exist comfortably between worlds. Lyrian appeared beside Emma without warning, as was her habit, and the elven woman looked pleased, saying Emma was advancing faster than any other candidates because her quantum's legaso had remarkable plasticity. Emma replied that was a fancy way of saying she died and came back weird. But she spoke without bitterness because she had made peace with what she had become, since being trapped between dimensions while your body vaporized tended to give you perspective on life. Lyrian laughed and said all the best people were weird, and told Emma to look at her as an example across the solar system. Humanity transformation continued at a pace that alarmed some of the more conservative council species because Earth now hosted the Dimensional Defense Initiative headquarters, which was a sprawling complex existing partially in normal space and partially in carefully controlled pocket dimensions. Admiral Carter oversaw military aspects with the same practical efficiency she had brought to conventional warfare, and her flagship, the EDS Transcendent, was humanity's first dimensional capable warship, with its hull inscribed with equations that made reality more like suggestions than laws. When the ship needed to move between spaces, Carter walked through the Transcendent bridge demanding a status report, and the bridge crew was a mix of baseline humans and emerging dimensional hybrids like Emma Lieutenant Sophie Kane, who now served as primary sensor analyst because of her natural ability to read quantum fluctuations, enhanced by Lyrian. Training reported all systems were normal, and the dimensional drive was charged and ready, and they could transit to another dimension in 40 seconds if needed. Carter said dryly, they should not do that because last time he tested the drive in that dimension, they nearly triggered a spatial inversion that would have turned Mars inside out, so they would stick to normal space for routine patrols. The diplomatic front ambassador, Kyra Blackwood, found herself in the unusual position of being both humanity representative and the council foremost expert on dimensional warfare, and her office in the council station had become a hub of constant activity as species after species requested consultations and training programs in defensive systems. Maya Brooks, who managed Kyra's impossible schedule with admirable efficiency, reported the aliens from Venom worlds were asking for another demonstration of dimensional shielding, and the Kresh wanted to know if humans could teach their ship commanders basic dimensional navigation, and the Crystalline Collective had sent 17 different proposals for joint research, and Vexter wanted a private meeting. Kyra looked up from casualty estimates she had been reviewing and asked if it was the same. Vexter, who tried to blackmail them and destroyed the Armstrong Beza, Maya confirmed it was the same and said he claimed it was urgent and personal. Kyra considered refusing out of spite, but that would not serve humanity interests, so she told Maya to schedule him for that afternoon and make sure security scanned him thoroughly because she trusted him about as far as she could throw him. When Vexter arrived, he looked diminished somehow, with his compound eyes, usually blazing with arrogance, now seeming dimmed, and his mandibles clacking nervously. Vexter thanked Kyra for seeing him. Kyra said coldly that he had destroyed her daughter's station and killed 3,000 people to make a point about sovereignty, so he should forgive her if this was not a warm meeting. Vexter said he came to apologize, and the words seemed to pain him as he explained, not as speaker of the Kresh, but as someone who made a catastrophic error in judgment, because he saw humans as lesser beings, needing control, and saw Lyrian as a threat needing elimination, and he was wrong on both counts, and his actions cost lives on both sides. Kyra studied him, looking for deception or angles, and found only genuine regret. So she asked what changed his mind. Vexter said he saw his own people die in the Harvester attack, and watched their most advanced weapons fail while humanity's mysterious friend and her dragon saved everyone. But more than that, he spoke with his daughter, who was one of the Kresh volunteers training with the Dimensional Defense Initiative, and she told him about the humans she worked with and how they shared knowledge freely and treated her as an equal and risked their lives to protect species that once looked down on them. Kyra had not known Vexter had a daughter training on Earth, because the programs had expanded so rapidly she could not track every individual Vexter. Said his daughter was Lieutenant Carvox, and she spoke highly of Commander Emma Blackwood, who apparently saved her life during a training accident involving an unstable dimensional rift because Emma pulled her back from a collapsing pocket dimension at risk to her own coherence. Kyra felt a surge of pride because that sounded like Emma, who was reckless and brave and unable to watch someone die if she could prevent. Yet Kyra asked if Vexter was here to make amends. Vexter said he was offering the creche full support for humanity. Leadership of dimensional defense with no conditions and no reservations because they were wrong to oppose humans, and he was wrong. And the creche had never been good at admitting mistakes because they were warlike and stubborn and convinced of their own superiority, but they were not stupid and recognized when the battlefield changed and when new leadership was needed. Kyra nodded slowly and said she appreciated the apology and accepted the support offer, but wanted something else. Tu Vexter asked what she wanted. Kyra said she wanted to know about the 3,000 who died at Armstrong Base, and not as statistics, but as people, because the creche maintained detailed records of those they killed in warfare, and she wanted their names and their stories, so she could ensure they were remembered proper. Vexter compound eyes widened because most species treated enemy casualties as mere numbers, and he asked if Kyra would honor them even though they were killed by his order. Kyra said they were killed in a pointless act of aggression, yes, but they were people with families and dreams and lives that mattered, and they deserved to be remembered, all of them, both human and creche. Vexter bowed, which was a gesture of profound respect in creche culture, and said then Kyra would have their records, all of them. After Vexter left, Kyra sat in silence thinking about 3,000 names she would soon receive, and thinking about Emma, live against all probability, and thinking about the future. Rushing toward them, Allah, soft sound, announced another visitor, and Lyrian materialized in the office, literally fading into existence like she had always been. There Kyra asked if Lyrian had been eavesdropping. Lyrian said shamelessly yes, because she was curious how humans would handle their new position, since power corrupts, as the saying goes, and she wanted to see if Kyra would use her advantage to punish Vexa. Kyra asked what Lyrian thought. Lyrian said Kyra had demanded remembrance for the dead and insisted on acknowledging the humanity of enemies, and she was either remarkably wise or remarkably foolish, and Lyrian genuinely could not tell which. Kyra laughed and asked why it could not be both, and then asked Lyrian why she really chose humanity, because the coffee story seemed thin for revolutionizing galactic civilization. Lyrian was silent for a long moment, with her purple eyes distant, and finally said the truth was she had been dying when she emerged into this dimension, because she was fleeing something in her home realm that made the harvester swarm look like an annoyance, and she was wounded and desperate and barely holding coherence together. And when she appeared terrifying and incomprehensible, the first human to reach her was not a soldier with weapons, but a maintenance worker named Carlos Rodriguez, who offered her a chair and asked if she was okay. Kyra said she knew Carlos because he still worked at the Compexarian, said she knew and visited him sometimes, and he still offered terrible coffee. And then she smiled sadly, saying humanity was young and aggressive, and made terrible mistakes sometimes, but they had something most older species had lost, which was the instinct to help before calculating whether it was strategically